Hello, chapter 18, the history of life. So over this video and the next, I'm going to track the history of life through Earth's history, about 3.5 billion years worth. In the last episode, we saw fossils, and we saw how fossils can be used to learn about ancient organisms and to recreate the past in terms of continents and supercontinents and past ecosystems. And now we're going to basically link those different ideas. So in other words, link the fossils that we find in the fossil record and just kind of progressively work our way through the history of life on Earth. So it's thought that life evolved, or life first appeared in the oceans, right? And so the first life, what would you expect it to look like? Would all of a sudden we get fish swimming? No, we're going to start with the simplest life. And the simplest life, the least complex life on Earth and in the fossil record, is bacteria. So bacteria are single-celled organisms, and they've got DNA, and they've got a plasma membrane, and they've got a cell wall. They've got proteins. And so there are some basic ingredients that all living organisms need in order to be alive, right? Those things that I just mentioned included. So how in the world did these molecules come together to create the first bacteria-like creatures a long time ago? I mean, nobody knows is the answer, but scientists are working on it. They've been working on it for about 60, 70 years, and so we can go back to a pretty famous experiment in the 1950s by a guy named Stanley Miller. And so Stanley Miller said, all right, how in the world are we going to get the first life coming from non-life, right? So how would living organisms evolve from non-living molecules? And so he said, you know what, maybe there were some basic building blocks on Earth. So maybe the Earth's ancient atmosphere was water and methane and hydrogen and so on. And then maybe lightning struck the surface of the Earth, and the energy from the lightning bolt got passed on to some of these molecules, and it started rearranging things and basically made some of the first molecules of life. And so he set up an experiment that looked like what you see here in the picture. So he filled a beaker with water, and he seeded it with some methane and ammonia. Ammonia has nitrogen in it. And basically he allowed some of that to evaporate, and then he zapped it with sparks. So this was simulating lightning through the atmosphere. And then he collected the molecules that were created from this. And the molecules that he made that were really important are amino acids. So he was able to synthesize amino acids from these building blocks. So if you recall from earlier in the semester, back when we were still meeting as human beings in the same room, he was able to create amino acids. And amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And all living organisms need proteins to be alive. So where did proteins come from? Well, Miller's idea was that lightning and just raw ingredients in the atmosphere were able to create amino acids, and then these amino acids were able to come together and form proteins. So Stanley Miller did not create life from non-life in his experiments, but he was able to create a molecule of life from molecules that aren't necessarily associated as closely with living things. All right, other possible sources of the building blocks of life include hydrothermal vents. So if you dive in a submarine deep in the ocean, you find places where heat from underneath the surface of the ocean, or the bottom of the ocean, is leaking out, and this heat creates steam. And these hydrothermal vents are places where you basically get like really hot water. And when we look at these places, we find that these hydrothermal vents can produce amino acids. So maybe instead of lightning striking the atmosphere and forming the first amino acids, maybe the first amino acids were formed deep under the ocean. And if that's true, then you have amino acids assembling, and then you get proteins assembling, and maybe the proteins helped build the first living organisms. And that would make a lot of sense because the oldest fossils we find are of bacteria that are in the oceans. Another idea is maybe Earth was seeded from space. And so what's really weird is we found that some asteroids have amino acids. And so somehow in space these amino acids are forming, and maybe an asteroid or meteorite or something landed on Earth's surface and seeded it with amino acids, and then those amino acids formed proteins, and those proteins helped create the first living organisms. So I don't know, still pretty sketchy, but scientists are working on how life evolved from non-life. Okay, so I mentioned that the earliest life on Earth was bacteria, and the rocks that have, or the fossils that have evidence of bacteria are dated at about 3.5 billion years old, plus or minus a few 100 million years, depending on who you talk to. And for the first 2 billion years of Earth's history with life on it, it was just bacteria. And these bacteria grew in these huge mats called stromatolites, and that's what you can see in this picture. So these things look like rocks, but they're actually these big piles of trillions and trillions of bacteria. And these bacteria are living together in like this thick, slimy soup. And again, some of the oldest fossils resemble these modern stromatolites. So bacteria are thought to have evolved first, and some of these bacteria eventually were able to undergo photosynthesis. And about 3 billion years ago, what we find from some pretty complex tests where they're trying to figure out how much oxygen was in the ancient atmosphere, they find that oxygen started to accumulate around 3 billion years ago. Now, why do we care? Well, we care because it's kind of weird to have an atmosphere with so much oxygen in it. Where did the oxygen come from? And it's thought that the oxygen was the byproduct of the photosynthesis from these bacteria. So the bacteria are basically, undergoing the photosynthetic process like we talked about earlier in the semester, and as a waste product, they're producing oxygen. And initially, there aren't a lot of organisms that are undergoing aerobic respiration, so the rate of oxygen production is higher than the rate of the rate of the consumption of oxygen. So oxygen levels built up, and then that oxygen formed ozone, and the ozone helped filter out UV rays from the sun, and so that helped cut down on mutations and made Earth more habitable for more complex life forms. And over time, more advanced life forms began to evolve. So some of these bacteria became various protists and algae, and then eventually became multicellular organisms. All right, and then we fast forward a few billion years to the Cambrian period. So if you remember, you're required to know the 3 main eras of Earth's history. And so the Paleozoic era is the first one. And the Paleozoic era begins with the Cambrian period. And during this time, we find some of the first diverse and complex animal life. Now, a few things about the animal life. It's all aquatic, it's all marine animal life, and it's all fairly small, and it's all really weird. So you'll see more pictures of these in the next couple slides, but the early animals they faintly resemble some animals that are alive today, but generally speaking, the species that we find from the beginning of the Paleozoic era are species that have long gone extinct. So a lot of really weird stuff. The appearance of these animals happens relatively quickly, over a few million years. So sometimes this event of animals appearing in fairly complex forms and animals representing some of the basic body patterns of modern animals, this is termed the Cambrian explosion. So it's not an explosion like a James Bond explosion. This is just a rapid appearance of lots of new species that haven't existed before in the fossil record, and they appear in a relatively short period of time, geologically speaking. Okay, so here are some examples of some of the critters we find at the beginning of the Paleozoic that show up in the Cambrian explosion. So Hallucigenia, so this thing would have fit in the palm of your hand. You can see it's basically like this tube worm with these leg-like extensions and these weird spikes sticking out of its back. We find Marella. This is kind of like an arthropod, so it has this exoskeleton. We find another arthropod, Sydnea, kind of weird. And then we find this guy is Opabenia. And so Opabenia is my favorite. So you can see it's kind of like a, superficially it looks like a fish. I mean, it's got a tail, and then it has these kind of wings that function kind of like maybe like flippers. But it had this cluster of weird eyes on its head, and it had this proboscis that was kind of like a trunk that it would use to probe the seafloor, and it had claspers on the end. You can see them in this picture, and it would catch other critters and eat them. So it was a predator, but pretty weird stuff, right? So these don't really resemble the critters that we see in the ocean today. All right, and the next period is the Ordovician. So this started around, whereas and I don't think I told you when the Cambrian began. The Cambrian was around 544 to 540 million years ago. The next period is the Ordovician. So notice, by the way, here's the Cambrian, and then the next layer up is the Ordovician. So what we're going to do is kind of build the fossil record as we progress. But in the Ordovician period, we start to find fish. All right, and in fact, all of the fossils that we find in the Ordovician are marine, so we don't really find any land animals. We don't find plants. There's still photosynthetic algae in the sea, but we're not finding any land fossils, so similar to the Cambrian in that regards. And the animals that we find are fish, and the fish are weird though. So initially we get a lot of jawless fish, and that's what the name suggests. They're fish that lack a jaw. So look at this guy. So he's an early jawless fish. So he's got a tail at the end, on the backside that looks, that function a lot like a modern fish tail, right? But he doesn't have other fins. And then on this end, he's got a mouth, but he doesn't have the ability to open or close the mouth. So it's jawless. It's just an opening, and she probably filtered seawater and got food that way, or at least ate prey that was soft-bodied. Over time, we started to get jaws. So the fish get jaws. How did that happen? Well, this is how scientists think that fish jaws evolved. So this would be that jawless fish that we just looked at. So again, an opening that served as the mouth, and then they have these gill slits, so openings that served as gills, and so they would take water in, and the water would pass through these gills, and they would get oxygen, and they also took food in. So initially they kind of breathed and ate through these same structures. So they would filter the water for food, while at the same time filtering the water for oxygen. And they had these bones or skeletal rods that help support the gill slits, right? And over time, it's thought that some of these skeletal rods in the front of the face became stronger, and the muscles kind of became stronger, and these bones help support the mouth. And so this is the beginning of a jaw. And so the jaw is basically an adaptation or modification of these skeletal rods. And so the primitive jawed fish, they have this upper jawbone that's not really attached to their cranium. It's still kind of loose, and these bones allowed them to open and close their mouth, and they could snap and bite food like this scary placoderm fish. But then over time, the jaws became even more advanced, and we get modern shark jaws where the top portion of the jaw is fused with the cranium, but the lower part of well, is that true? I'm not sure that's true for sharks, my bad. But anyway, the jaw, it is true for mammals and reptiles, but I'm not positive about sharks. But anyway, the point is, a shark jaw is even more complex and more advanced than this. And so a shark jaw, in this great white, for example, it can open its jaw really wide and actually like take big bites of its prey. So over time, jaws evolve. That's the point. In the Silurian, around 444 million years ago, we get all sorts of weird fish still. We start getting some armored fish, and where arthropods, or animals that have an exoskeleton, like crabs and insects in modern times, we find lots of arthropods in the oceans. But the arthropods are pretty weird. So here's a sea scorpion. So it's next to a modern human, just to give you a sense of scale. So really big, weird sea scorpions and big, weird arthropods swimming around in the oceans. You wouldn't want to go for a swim off the beach during the Silurian. And then you also get more jawless fish, but the jawless fish are becoming more and more armored. So you can see they've got these bony sections initially on their head and other parts of the body. So why would a fish have a bony section? Why would they have a bony head? Well, one idea is that because there's predators around that have these fancy jaws to bite them, and so that now they need protection from predators. In the Devonian, we're starting to get even more primitive jawed forms, or I guess we're starting to get fish that more closely resemble modern fish. On land, we're starting to get mosses and other early plants, which, by the way, I missed that. I forgot that. In the Silurian, you get these weird plants called Cooksonia. So it's thought that algae are starting to live on the seashore, or maybe these algae gave rise to land plants. But initially, the land plants would have been really small, like Lego man sized. And then the plants became mosses and other modern plant species, or resembling modern plant species. But initially, the plants lived near water, so they weren't really all over the land. They were just on the edge of the seashore, maybe around lakes and rivers and streams. In time, you get fern-like plants and you get larger trees, so they start showing up at the end of the Devonian. These initial plants and forests, again, would have been Lego man size, so really small. Arthropods, we start to get some terrestrial arthropods. So arthropods that have been swimming in the oceans, but they start moving onto land and maybe they're feeding on the plants. And then we start getting some fish that it looks like they start moving onto land to feed on these arthropods. And so if all of your fish are swimming around the ocean, they're competing with each other. But if you've got these tasty arthropods that have moved on land to eat plants, then it would be beneficial if some of the sea creatures could move onto land to hunt. So we get fish that are moving on the land, and we're starting to get, in the Devonian, we start to get some early amphibians, which I'll talk about, and tetrapods, which I'll talk more about in a second. Okay, so fish move onto land and give rise to the first tetrapods. So tetrapods, tetra means four and pod means feet. So tetrapods have 4 legs, 4 feet, and they have lungs. And so technically we are tetrapods. We have 4 legs. I mean, our front legs aren't legs anymore, they're arms, but we have lungs. So technically humans, as well as birds and dinosaurs and reptiles and amphibians, are all tetrapods. So the first tetrapods evolved from fish. You'll see that more in the next slide. And in order for tetrapods to survive on land, they needed to adapt their bodies to living on land. So living on land has different constraints than living in the water. And so on land, you need lungs to take in big gulps of air, whereas in the water, you can filter the water to get oxygen through your gills, like we talked about earlier. On land, you don't have the support of the water around you, so you need heavier bones and stronger muscles to support against the pull of gravity. For hearing, fish can hear by detecting vibrations in the water, but sound moves as vibrations through air in a way that's different than it does during land. So as these tetrapods moved onto land, they're going to have to modify their ears so they can hear airborne sounds, which requires different bone structure than hearing underwater. And moving on to land, you also have to prevent drying out. So underwater, you don't worry about drying out for obvious reasons. But on land, air is really dry and the sun shines on you and it gets hot. And so these critters have to figure out a way to not dry out. So, my dog's whining. He's probably stuck on the stairs. His name's Roger. He's ancient and his back legs don't work very well. He sounds like he's stuck. Anyway, I apologize for telling you that. Don't worry. He's fine. I'll get him in a minute. Okay, so as fish transitioned to land, I mentioned they needed some adaptations. So let's look at some fossils that are represented from this time, from the Devonian. And here are a couple of interesting fossils, interesting species that were around. So this is Eusthenopteron. This is a fish, but it's weird because it has internal nostrils. So why would a fish have internal nostrils unless maybe it's taking in some air? So your nostrils, sure, you can smell with them, but you also breathe with them, and your nostrils are connected to your lungs. So this is definitely a fish, don't get me wrong, but it's a fish with nostrils. So again, that's kind of weird. So it's thought that maybe this guy, while he lived in the oceans, maybe he could kind of come on the land and eat some arthropod snacks, and then he moved back into the water. Tiktaalik is another fossil from this time. He shows up after this guy. And Tiktaalik is really weird. It's a fish, but it looks a lot like an amphibian. So amphibians are salamanders and frogs. And Tiktaalik had, you can see he's got these hind fins and these front fins. And the bones and the muscles in these look like they're really strong. So he might have been able to walk around on land better than this guy. He also had wrists, so he could bend his fins, and that would help support his body. He also had a neck, so fish don't have a neck. They can't turn to look to the left or the right, but Tiktaalik could. And he also had kind of this primitive rib cage. So your rib cage surrounds your torso, and your rib cage helps support your lungs. And so if this guy had a rib cage, well, maybe he had lungs. So if he had lungs, then he was breathing air. Why would a fish need to breathe air? It would need to breathe air if it's coming onto land. So Tiktaalik is kind of a transition between fish and amphibians. And then this is Ichthyostega, which this is one of the first amphibians that we find. So it's not a fish, but it still resembles a fish in that it's got these limbs with webbing between its feet, so it probably was still swimming. It's still got a long tail, but it was a tetrapod because it has true legs and it had a rib cage and lungs. So we get a transition from fish to fish that could maybe breathe air, to fish that were spending more time on land, to amphibians. My phone's ringing. It's crazy over here. All right, so this is showing you, look at the bottom here. This is showing some of these early fish. Here's Tiktaalik, which I just talked about. And so the early fish, again, their fins kind of had bone structure like this. And so this is definitely a fin. But look how this bone structure changes over time. So this fin turns into this, and then it turns into this. So an early amphibian, so one bone, two bones, little bones, and then finger bones. Does that sound familiar? We talked earlier about how all mammals and reptiles have this one bone, two bones, wrist and finger bone pattern. And so it starts to show up in your amphibians, and it looks like it's transitioning from a full-blown flipper to a full-blown leg. All right, I mentioned amphibians show up after evolving from tetrapods. And so amphibians are interesting. So amphibians are still alive today, again, as frogs and salamanders and so on. And they're interesting. If you know anything about frogs, you know that some frogs can live on land. Toads live on land, for example. But they have to reproduce and develop in water. So a frog will lay its eggs in the water. In this picture, you can see two frogs mating. And basically, they move into the water, and the female releases her eggs into the water, and the male releases his sperm, and the sperm fertilizes the eggs. And then the eggs develop into a tadpole. So a tadpole is basically a little fish. So it has gills, and it's got a tail, and it doesn't have legs, and it swims around. But as it develops, it will go through a stage where it has a tail, but then it starts to grow legs. And then eventually the tail goes away, the legs become developed, and it grows lungs, and the gills go away. And so then an adult frog or toad or salamander will typically be able to breathe air. Right? So amphibians are still reliant on the water. Right? They need to reproduce in water and develop in water, but they're also able to live on land. So amphibians are thought to represent a bridge between the fully aquatic fish or the semi-aquatic fish and then the fully terrestrial reptiles and other animals that we'll talk about shortly. Yeah, this is just showing some of the in-between species. I'm just going to skip this, actually. All right, in the Carboniferous, which is still in the Paleozoic. During the Carboniferous, we get these forests of really big but primitive plants, and then we get all sorts of different amphibians. So we get tons of big amphibians that are living in these swampy forests, and we also get some of the first reptiles. And so during the Carboniferous, we get ancient amphibians, early reptiles, and we get lots of arthropods. So if you've ever heard of like a dragonfly with a 6-foot wingspan, they were alive during the Carboniferous. All right, we also get the first amniotes during the Carboniferous. So amniotes are vertebrates that lay an egg that has a shell and different layers. And the amniotic egg is able to be laid on land. And so the egg, gosh, can you hear my dog whining? It's terrible. I need to go rescue him. The amniotic egg can be laid on land and it doesn't dry out. Remember the amphibian eggs? These things, they're really jelly-like and slimy, and they need to be laid in water. So amphibians have to reproduce in water, but amniotes don't. They can lay their eggs on land. So if you think about even an aquatic reptile like a crocodile, it'll still lay its amniotic eggs on land in a nest. And so reptiles are amniotes, birds are amniotes, and technically mammals are amniotes too. We'll talk about that later. So the appearance of the amniotes allowed animals to move away from a dependency on water and spend more and more time on land. And so this gives rise to the reptiles. So in the next period, the Permian, this kicks off the Mesozoic, and in the Permian we get all sorts of cool reptiles, which you can see in the picture. And these are all reptiles, so you might think this is a dinosaur, but this is Dimetrodon, it's a reptile. And so these reptiles, again, are laying amniotic eggs on land, and they're living on dry land, and you're getting all sorts of, again, crazy reptiles. At this period of time, you also get the supercontinent Pangaea, which we talked about in the last video. And so Pangaea slowly becomes full of all sorts of different species of reptiles. The plants change as well. We get the first gymnosperms, which, if you remember from lab, this modern species include pines and firs and spruces, but the ancient gymnosperms were more like ginkgos. And anyway, so you get more modern like trees during this time, and some of the reptiles would have been eating these. The Mesozoic, we get even more reptiles, and the reptiles are starting to dominate not just the land, but they're also moving back into the seas. So we get aquatic reptiles like this guy, and we also get reptiles that are flying, so pterodactyls and the like. And we also get the first dinosaurs. So this would be the first dinosaur, kind of this chicken-sized little guy running around on 2 legs. And we also get the first mammals. And these mammals would have been egg-laying mammals, and they have a lot of characteristics that are in common with reptiles. So dinosaurs expand in the Mesozoic, and by the Jurassic, we've got all sorts of dinosaurs. So the big sauropods, and we've got dinosaurs running around on 2 legs like Allosaurus and T-Rex. And then we got Ichthyostega and other aquatic reptiles in the oceans. And then we start to get some feathered dinosaurs, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Here I've got the first mammals appearing in the Jurassic. So they're appearing somewhere around the end of the Triassic and the early Jurassic. All right, in the Jurassic, I mentioned feathered dinosaurs. So there's all sorts of different feathered dinosaurs, and they start showing up around 150 million years ago. And these feathered dinosaurs eventually evolved into birds. So I just want to make the point that dinosaurs technically aren't extinct. Okay, the dinosaurs that you think about from the Jurassic Park movies, they're extinct, but birds technically are a feathered flying dinosaur. And so whenever you eat chicken tacos, technically you're eating dinosaur tacos, just so you know. These feathered dinosaurs eventually have a lot of bird characteristics. So Archaeopteryx is a good example of that. Archaeopteryx appears in the Jurassic, and here's a picture of it. This is a picture of it. This is a picture of it. This is a picture of it, and this is the original fossil that was found. And from the fossils, we see that they've got all these feathers, and the feathers look like flight feathers. So it could probably fly, right? Which is very bird-like, having wings and feathers and being able to fly. But it's also very dinosaur-like. It's got a beak with teeth in it. So birds now really don't have teeth. Maybe you've noticed that. So they have a bill without teeth, but Archaeopteryx had teeth. It's also got a tail that has feathers coming off of it. So birds have a tail that's made out of feathers. Think of a hawk flying. Definitely has tail feathers, but it doesn't have a reptile tail. Archaeopteryx, if you were to look in this tail, it had bones. So in fact, you can see it in this fossil. So these bones are the bones of its tail. So they had like a bony reptilian tail. So Archaeopteryx is kind of a mashup of a bird and a reptile, like a dinosaur. So again, it's thought to be an early bird-like dinosaur. Here's an example of some feathered dinos. So we don't know what they look like. So these are artist reconstructions that I stole off the internet. But 20 years ago, when I was your age, we thought that dinosaurs all had reptilian-like skin. So if you watch the original Jurassic Park movies, sorry to keep bringing that up, but they had, reptile-like skin. But some fossils out of China over the last 20 years have shown that there were a lot of feathered dinosaurs. And some of these dinosaurs had feathers that weren't necessarily used for flight. Okay, so let me talk about feathers for a second. So a bird has feathers that are used for flight, and those feathers are found on its wings. But they also have feathers that are used for display. So think of a male peacock's tail. And birds also have feathers that are used for warmth. So think of the down feathers on a duck, or the down feathers that we've stolen from a duck and put into your down sleeping bag. So feathers can be used for flight or for display or for warmth. And so these dinosaurs that have feathers, they're not necessarily flying. They're probably using these feathers to stay warm or for displaying different colors and for attracting mates. So feathers first appear not to fly, but to do other things. And so the earliest feathers we see, they're kind of like these filaments, so they would have looked fuzzy. And then they started looking more like down feathers, and then over time they became these asymmetrical flight feathers. So modern birds have some of these and some of these on them, and the early dinosaurs had these, and then later they had these, and then others had these. So you can kind of see the evolution of feathers over time. This is another feathered dinosaur, just so we're not focusing all on Archaeopteryx. This is Sinornithosaurus. I don't know if I'm saying that right. This one's from China, I believe. And you can see the feathers in the fossil. You can see, like Archaeopteryx, it has a reptile-like tail. And so it probably was a lot like a modern bird. It even had feathers on its hind legs, which is kind of cool. Velociraptor, if you remember, these were like, one of the main bad guys in Jurassic Park 1 other than T-Rex. And this is what they look like in the movie. But there have been some interesting fossils found in the last 20 years that suggest that maybe Velociraptor was fuzzy. So maybe it was covered in these downy feathers and it looked more like this, which I think is kind of more terrifying just because it's so weird. So in the Cretaceous, which is going to wrap up the Mesozoic, we get dinosaurs of all different types, just crazy, just huge flying reptiles and dinosaurs with bones and spikes and sails and aquatic reptiles. So dinosaurs just dominate the earth. During the Cretaceous, we get the first flowering plants that are appearing in large numbers. And we haven't seen flowers until the Cretaceous. But they show up, and when the flowers show up, it shouldn't be a huge surprise, but we start seeing pollinators. So the first flies and bees and even ants and other insects, they start to show up in large numbers in the Cretaceous. The Mesozoic and the Cretaceous both end with an asteroid impact. So the technical phrase for this is the KT asteroid impact hypothesis. So I won't get into what that means, but basically the idea is at the end of the Cretaceous, this huge asteroid, a couple of, multiple miles wide, slammed into Earth. And it hit Earth down here off the coast of modern-day Mexico. And when it did, it brought so much energy that it was basically like a bunch of nuclear bombs going off all at once. And so the energy from this asteroid would have vaporized, would have sent these shock waves and tsunamis throughout the region and would have wiped out anything alive in the southern US, for example. But what's significant about this asteroid strike is that it put up a bunch of debris into the atmosphere, and that debris initially may have raised the Earth's temperature by a few degrees and just cooked stuff. And then over time, it may have caused climate change. It may have done some other things too, like maybe caused volcanoes to start erupting around the Earth and stuff like that. But the point is, this asteroid impact created a climate change that caused all the dinosaurs, except for the birds, to go extinct. And in fact, a lot of species went extinct in the oceans and on land. And it seems that smaller animals did better, and animals that could move, like birds, or animals that could burrow, like the mammals that were alive at the time, seemed to be able to kind of stick it out and eke out a living in this kind of, really bad scenario. So we find that when the Mesozoic ends, we don't find any more dinosaur fossils. So they basically disappear at the end of the Mesozoic. All right, that's the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic. Next time, oh, whoops. Uh, this is where the asteroid hit. And when they do these surveys of the geology in this area, they find this huge crater. So the reason they think it hit here is because there's this huge crater here, and this huge crater is an old asteroid impact site, and it's big enough to represent an asteroid that would have caused huge changes around the globe. So anyway, and the timing is right. It hit right at the end of the Mesozoic, or the end of the Cretaceous. Okay, now I'm wrapping it up. The end.